What if a queen's final breath was the opening shot in a brutal war? What if the medieval world's delicate balance tipped not with a king's mighty roar, but with a queen's sudden silence? Between the 12th and 16th centuries, the deaths of powerful women shattered peace and plunged kingdoms into chaos. Number 7. Isabella I of Castile. In November 1504, the air within the medieval palace of Medina del Campo was heavy with a quiet dread. For weeks, Queen Isabella I of Castile had been fading, the woman who, alongside her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, had unified Spain, funded Christopher Columbus's voyages, and overseen the Reconquista, was slipping away. She was barely into her 50s, but a long, arduous reign had taken its toll, compounded by the profound grief of losing almost all her children and grandchildren, one after another, in quick succession. Her only surviving child, Joanna, was herself, troubled, often referred to as Joanna the Mad, a description that would haunt her legacy. Isabella's final will, a meticulously crafted document, was meant to ensure a smooth transition of power. She named Joanna as her primary heir to the throne of Castile, but understanding Joanna's fragile mental state, Isabella included a crucial clause. If Joanna was deemed incapable of ruling, her husband, Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria, and son of Emperor Maximilian I, would take the reins. Furthermore, Isabella appointed her own husband Ferdinand as Joanna and Philip's regent, holding vast powers over the kingdom's administration and military. This was an attempt to maintain Castilian independence and ensure stability, keeping power within her immediate family and preventing Philip from dominating the kingdom. Through Joanna, on November 26, 1504, Isabella I breathed her last. The news rippled across Europe, sending shockwaves through every royal court. To Ferdinand, it was a profound personal loss, but also a political earthquake. He had been a co-monarch, a king in his own right, but his claim to Castile rested on his marriage to Isabella. Now, without her, he was merely a consort, his power dependent on the will of his daughter and son-in-law. Philip the Handsome, however, saw Isabella's death as his moment. He had always resented Ferdinand's influence and Isabella's shrewd political maneuvering. He believed the Castilian throne was his rightful inheritance through Joanna, and he had no intention of sharing power with his father-in-law. Philip immediately began to assert his claim, insisting that he and Joanna should rule Castile directly without any regency. He argued that Joanna's alleged incapacity was exaggerated, or at least that it did not justify Ferdinand's continued authority. The scene was set for a bitter dynastic struggle. Ferdinand, a seasoned and cunning statesman, was not about to relinquish control easily. He had spent decades building the unified Spain, and he viewed Philip as an ambitious foreign upstart who cared little for Castilian interests. He knew that if Philip gained full control, Castile might become little more than a satellite of the powerful Habsburg Empire. Philip, on his side, had powerful allies. His father was the Holy Roman Emperor, and his family controlled vast territories across Europe. He also had the support of a faction within the Castilian nobility who chafed under Ferdinand's firm hand and saw an opportunity for greater influence under a new, less experienced monarch. These Castilian nobles, led by figures like the Duke of Nájera and the Constable of Castile, hoped that Philip's arrival would grant them greater liberties and privileges. A stark contrast to Isabella's and Ferdinand's strong, centralized rule. As Philip and Joanna prepared to sail from Flanders to Castile, Ferdinand tried to consolidate his position. He sought to marry Germaine de Foix, a niece of King Louis XII of France, a move aimed at securing an alliance with France and potentially producing a new heir to Aragon, which might lessen his dependence on the Castilian throne and his difficult daughter-in-law. This move was widely seen as a betrayal in Castile, further fueling the divisions. When Philip and Joanna finally arrived in Castile in 1506, a tense standoff ensued. Ferdinand, relying on his popularity and the power granted to him by Isabella's will, initially held the upper hand. But Philip quickly gained support from Castilian nobles who were tired of Ferdinand's long reign and eager for new patronage. Castilian Cortes, the kingdom's parliament, was convened, and intense negotiations and political maneuvering began. The situation verged on civil war. Armies were raised by both sides. Cities and towns declared their allegiance, some for Ferdinand, some for Philip. Skirmishes broke out in various regions, and the threat of a full-blown conflict loomed large over the Iberian Peninsula. The very fabric of the recently unified Spain seemed on the verge of unraveling, all because of the vacuum left by a queen's death and the clashing ambitions of those who sought to fill it. Ferdinand, faced with mounting pressure and a potential full-scale war he did not want, eventually agreed to a compromise. The Concord of Villafafala, signed in June 1506, formally recognized Philip and Joanna as the monarchs of Castile. Effectively sidelining Ferdinand, Philip declared himself king. Just a few months later, in September 1506, Philip I suddenly died. His death, likely from typhus, plunged Castile into even deeper chaos as Joanna's mental state deteriorated further, and Ferdinand was forced to return to reclaim the regency, leading to years of political instability before his own death. The struggle that erupted after Isabella's death would continue to ripple through the kingdom for years, a testament to the power she wielded even in her absence. Number 6. Mary of Burgundy. The bitterly cold March wind whipped through the Low Countries in 1482, as Mary of Burgundy, the richest heiress in Europe, rode out for a hunt near Ghent. She was young, only 25, but had already endured years of political turmoil since inheriting the vast Burgundian territories upon her father Charles the Bold's death in 1477. Her marriage to Maximilian, the first Archduke of Austria, had been a strategic alliance, forging a formidable power block against their shared rival, King Louis XI of France. But on this fateful day, her destiny took a sudden tragic turn. Her horse stumbled, throwing her violently from the saddle. She fell hard, reportedly breaking her back, and suffered severe internal injuries. Despite the best efforts of medieval physicians, her condition rapidly worsened. She lingered for a few weeks in excruciating pain before finally succumbing to her injuries on March 27, 1482. Mary's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political catastrophe for her husband Maximilian and for the future of the Burgundian state. She left behind 2 young children, Philip, a boy of 4, and Margaret, a girl of 2. According to feudal custom, the inheritance of the Burgundian lands, which included wealthy territories like Flanders, Brabant, and Holland, now passed to her young son, Philip. Maximilian, however, saw himself as the natural regent and guardian of his son's inheritance. He intended to govern the Burgundian lands in Philip's name, thereby securing his own power and continuing his struggles against France. But the powerful Estates of Flanders, deeply resentful of Maximilian's Austrian influence and determined to protect their traditional liberties and self-governance, had other ideas. They viewed Maximilian as a foreign interloper, too focused on his Habsburg dynastic ambitions and his wars with France, which often led to increased taxes and disruptions for the prosperous Flemish cities. The Estates of Flanders, comprising the most powerful cities and nobles of the region, saw Mary's death as an opportunity to reassert their autonomy. They argued that with Mary gone, their loyalty to Maximilian had weakened, and they would only acknowledge the infant Philip as their true ruler. They demanded that Maximilian sign the Treaty of Arras with Louis XI of France, which would effectively cede the strategically vital territory of Artois and the Duchy of Burgundy to France, and promised the marriage of Maximilian's daughter Margaret to the French Dauphin. Maximilian, furious but politically isolated, initially resisted these demands. He was determined to keep the entire Burgundian inheritance intact for his son and to maintain his position as its de facto ruler. He refused to abandon the fight against Louis XI, whom he considered the ultimate threat to his family's ambitions. This clash of wills immediately ignited conflict. The Flemish cities, led by Ghent, rose in open rebellion against Maximilian's authority. They refused to pay taxes, raised their own militias, and seized control of several key towns. They openly negotiated with Louis XI of France, promising him territorial concessions in exchange for his support against Maximilian. Louis XI, ever the opportunist, was delighted to exploit this internal strife within the Burgundian domains. He had long coveted the rich Burgundian territories, seeing them as essential for the expansion of his own kingdom. The War of the Burgundian Succession, though often overshadowed by larger conflicts, was a bitter and brutal struggle. Maximilian, despite facing overwhelming odds, fought back fiercely. He had to defend his son's inheritance against both the rebelling Flemish cities and the encroaching French army. He engaged in a series of sieges and battles, including the Siege of Utrecht, and various skirmishes across Flanders. The fighting was characterized by its localized but intense nature, with no major pitched battles, but constant raids, blockades, and urban warfare. Maximilian, though a skilled military commander, was often short on funds and facing powerful entrenched opposition. He struggled to raise sufficient troops and supplies as the Flemish cities controlled much of the wealth of the Low Countries. His campaigns were often characterized by their protracted nature as he attempted to break the will of the rebellious cities. The war dragged on for several years, devastating parts of the Low Countries. Towns were sacked, trade routes disrupted, and the economy suffered greatly. Ultimately exhausted by the struggle and realizing the precariousness of his position, Maximilian was forced to make concessions. In 1482, he signed the Treaty of Arras, a humiliating but necessary peace, which confirmed the cession of Artois and the Duchy of Burgundy to France, and saw his daughter Margaret sent to the French court to be educated as the future Queen of France. Mary of Burgundy's untimely death had not only cost Maximilian his beloved wife, but had also ripped apart the territories he had fought so hard to unite under Habsburg rule. The War of the Burgundian Succession, sparked by her demise and a subsequent power vacuum, set the stage for generations of Habsburg-Valois rivalry over these disputed lands, a conflict that would define much of European diplomacy and warfare for the next century. Number 5. Blanche I of Navarre. In April 1441, the quiet city of Santa Maria de Neva in Castile was plunged into mourning. Queen Blanche I of Navarre, a strong and capable ruler, lay dying. She was not old, barely in her 50s, but her health had been failing. Blanche had inherited the throne of Navarre in 1425 from her father, Charles III, bringing with her the powerful Aragonese crown through her second marriage to John, the King of Aragon. It was a union that had brought both stability and complex dynastic claims to the small Pyrenean kingdom. Blanche had worked tirelessly to maintain Navarre's independence. Navigating the treacherous waters between the powerful kingdoms of France and Aragon, she and John had several children, including a son, Charles, Prince of Vienna, who was universally recognized as her rightful heir. But Blanche's last will and testament contained a clause that would throw Navarre into utter chaos. Rather than simply naming Charles as her immediate successor, she stipulated that he should not assume the title of king without the consent and blessing of his father, John of Aragon. This was an extraordinary and unprecedented condition, seemingly designed to keep power within the family and prevent a potential rift between father and son. However, it placed immense power in John's hands, power he would use to disastrous effect. On April 3, 1441, Blanche I passed away. Her death immediately created a dangerous power vacuum. Her son Charles, Prince of Vienna, expected to succeed his mother immediately. He was popular within Navarre, particularly among the nobility and the common people, who saw him as their natural independent ruler. But King John of Aragon, driven by his own ambition and a desire to retain control over Navarre, immediately invoked the clause in Blanche's will. He declared that he would hold the crown of Navarre himself, effectively disinheriting his son from immediate rule. Until Charles demonstrated proper obedience and loyalty, this act was seen as a usurpation by many Navarrese. John of Aragon, already King of Aragon, Sicily, and Naples, saw Navarre as a valuable strategic asset, a bridge between his Iberian and Mediterranean possessions. He had no intention of relinquishing control to his son, whom he viewed as too independent and perhaps too sympathetic to the French sphere of influence. Charles, Prince of Viana, was deeply aggrieved. He was his mother's direct heir, and the Navarrese Cortes, the kingdom's representative assembly, largely supported his claim. However, John of Aragon, with the resources of the powerful Crown of Aragon behind him, refused to budge. He appointed Aragonese officials to key positions in Navarre, further alienating the local populace and the Navarrese nobility. The stage was set for the Navarre Civil War. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, festering wound that gradually turned into a brutal internecine conflict. Initially, the conflict was characterized by political maneuvering and diplomatic wrangling. Charles, unwilling to directly defy his powerful father, attempted to negotiate, to appeal to reason, and to gather support, but John remained intractable. The war began in earnest in 1451, a decade after Blanche's death, when Charles, frustrated by his father's refusal to see the throne, raised an army. He had the backing of the Aigramont faction, a powerful noble family and widespread popular support within Navarre. John, in turn, relied on the Beaumont faction, another influential noble family, and the vast military might of Aragon. The first major engagement, the Battle of Ibar in 1451, resulted in a decisive defeat for Charles, who was captured by his father's forces. This did not end the war, but merely intensified it. Charles was imprisoned, then released, only to find himself embroiled in further disputes with his father, who even tried to force him to marry a Castilian princess to further his own political agenda. The conflict became even more complicated when Charles died in 1461, under mysterious circumstances. Many suspected John of Aragon of having poisoned his son, though there is no definitive proof. Charles's death further enraged his supporters, who now turned their allegiance to his younger sister Eleanor and her husband, Gaston IV, Count of Foix, as the legitimate heirs to Navarre. But John of Aragon continued to hold the throne, ruling Navarre as his own, defying both his deceased son's will and the clear line of succession. The war continued, dragging on for decades, devastating the small kingdom. It was a brutal struggle of sieges, raids, and shifting allegiances, pitting Navarrese against Navarrese, and Aragon against sections of its own nobility and the Counts of Foix. Blanche's death and her carefully worded will had inadvertently opened Pandora's box of dynastic ambition and filial betrayal. The Navarrese Civil War, which lasted until 1479, was a direct consequence of the power struggle she unwittingly set in motion. Tore the kingdom apart, weakened its independence, and left a lasting scar on its history, all because a queen's death left a throne tragically contested. Number 4. Maria of Hungary. In early 1395, the court of Hungary was gripped by a sense of unease. Queen Maria, barely 23 years old, but a formidable ruler in her own right, was pregnant. She was the first reigning queen of Hungary, a title she had inherited in 1382 after the death of her father. Louis I, her reign had been turbulent, marked by power struggles with rebellious nobles, and a period of capture and imprisonment. She had eventually married Sigismund of Luxembourg, the future Holy Roman Emperor, a marriage that brought both a powerful ally and a complex dynamic to the Hungarian throne. Maria was a skilled horsewoman, often riding out on hunts, a common noble pastime in medieval Europe. On May 17, 1395, despite her advanced pregnancy, she joined a hunting party near the forests of Buda. What exactly happened is not definitively known, but her horse stumbled, or perhaps she lost control, and she was thrown violently from the saddle. The fall was catastrophic. She suffered severe injuries, and tragically both she and her unborn child died shortly after the accident. Her sudden and unexpected death plunged Hungary into immediate crisis. Maria was the last surviving member of the House of Anjou in Hungary, a dynasty that had ruled for nearly a century. With her death, the direct line of succession was broken. The throne was now technically vacant, or at least its rightful occupant was fiercely contested. Her husband Sigismund had been co-ruler, but his claim to the throne was not universally accepted. He was a foreigner, a German prince, and many Hungarian nobles deeply resented his growing influence and his attempts to centralize power. They viewed him as a king by marriage, not by direct inheritance, and they saw Maria's death as an opportunity to weaken his grip on the kingdom. The death of Maria instantly reignited the simmering conflicts between Sigismund and the powerful Hungarian magnates. These nobles, led by families like the Garai and the Lakifi, had long fought for greater autonomy and influence. They saw Sigismund as a usurper, a puppet of foreign powers, and they were determined to prevent him from fully consolidating his authority. Almost immediately, rival claimants emerged. The most prominent was Ladislaus of Naples, the young son of Charles III of Naples, who had briefly usurped Maria's throne in 1385 before being assassinated. Ladislaus had a strong, albeit disputed, dynastic claim through the Neapolitan branch of the Angevin, and he was supported by a significant faction of the Hungarian nobility, particularly those who opposed Sigismund. The war that followed Maria's death was less a single unified conflict and more a series of interconnected rebellions and skirmishes that destabilized Hungary for years. Sigismund found himself constantly battling internal opposition. The magnates formed leagues against him, refusing to pay taxes, raising their own armies, and openly defying his decrees. They seized royal castles and lands, effectively carving out their own personal fiefdoms within the kingdom. Ladislaus of Naples, encouraged by the Hungarian opposition, launched invasions from the south, attempting to press his claim. He was crowned King of Hungary in 1403, albeit with limited support and control by a faction of rebellious nobles and Zadar. This act further exacerbated the civil strife, as Sigismund had to divert resources to fight off both external invasion and internal rebellion. Conflict was characterized by its brutal and often treacherous nature. There were assassinations, imprisonments, and constant shifts in loyalty among the nobility. Sigismund was often forced to rely on foreign mercenaries and the support of his own Bohemian and German lands, which further alienated his Hungarian subjects. He spent years campaigning across Hungary, attempting to suppress rebellions and reassert his authority. The years following Maria's death were marked by a cycle of violence, tenuous truces, and renewed fighting. Sigismund managed to eventually consolidate his power, but only after years of struggle and by making significant concessions to the powerful magnates, granting them vast lands and privileges. The kingdom was exhausted, its resources drained, and its international standing weakened by the prolonged internal strife. Maria's untimely demise, leaving no direct heir of her body, had opened the gates to a dynastic free for all. It was a tragic end for a young queen, and the beginning of a prolonged and bloody struggle for the Hungarian throne, directly sparked by the sudden absence of the last undisputed link to its ruling dynasty. Number 3. Joanna I of Naples. On a cold day in May 1382, the small, picturesque castle of Muro Lucano in southern Italy became the site of a chilling act of violence. Queen Joanna I of Naples, a woman whose life had been a tempest of ambition, betrayal, and political intrigue, was murdered. She was 56, and her reign, which had begun 4 decades earlier in 1343, had been one of the most turbulent in European history. Joanna was a reigning queen, fiercely independent and shrewd, but her path had been fraught with peril. She had been accused of orchestrating the murder of her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, a crime that had led to the First Neapolitan War of Succession. She had weathered invasions, papal denunciations, and countless conspiracies. Her lack of a surviving male heir had been a constant source of anxiety, leading her to adopt Charles of Durazzo, a cousin and scion of a rival branch of her own Angevin family, as her heir. However, Joanna's volatile relationship with Charles of Durazzo soured dramatically. She grew to mistrust his ambition and perceived disloyalty. In a desperate move to secure her throne and punish Charles, she revoked his adoption and instead named Louis I, Duke of Anjou, the brother of King Charles V of France, as her new heir. This act was a direct challenge to Charles of Durazzo and set the stage for inevitable conflict. Charles of Durazzo, feeling betrayed and believing his claim to be stronger through the direct Angevin line, refused to accept Joanna's change of succession. He was supported by Pope Urban VI, who had his own political agenda and viewed Joanna with hostility. In 1381, Charles, with papal backing, invaded the Kingdom of Naples. He quickly seized the capital, captured Joanna, and imprisoned her in the castle of Muro Lucano. For months, Joanna was held captive, as negotiations and political maneuvering continued around her. But Charles of Durazzo, fearing that Louis of Anjou would arrive with a large French army to rescue her and press his own claim, decided to eliminate the problem permanently. On May 12, 1382, by Charles's order, Queen Joanna I was smothered to death with a silk pillow, a horrific echo of her first husband's suspected murder. Her death, an act of regicide, instantly ignited the War of the Neapolitan Succession, a brutal and protracted conflict that would engulf southern Italy for decades. Louis I of Anjou, upon hearing of Joanna's murder, immediately declared himself the rightful king of Naples, based on Joanna's last will and adoption. He raised a massive army, financed by the King of France and supported by the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, the rival to Urban VI during the Western Schism, and launched a full-scale invasion of southern Italy. The war was a clash of powerful dynasties and papal factions. On one side stood Charles of Durazzo, now crowned king, Charles III of Naples, supported by Pope Urban VI, and the Kingdom of Hungary, whose king, Louis I, had been Joanna's brother-in-law and nemesis. On the other side was Louis I of Anjou, backed by France and the Avignon papacy, bringing the 100 Years' War and the Great Schism into the heart of Italy. Conflict was characterized by its immense scale and devastating impact. Armies marched across the Italian peninsula, laying siege to cities, plundering the countryside and engaging in pitched battles. Louis of Anjou's initial invasion was enormous, but he struggled with logistics and financial difficulties. Charles III, a more seasoned military leader, managed to hold his ground despite being initially outnumbered. The war did not end with the death of either of the initial claimants. Louis I of Anjou died in 1384, but his son, Louis II of Anjou, continued the struggle. Charles III of Naples was assassinated in Hungary in 1386, while attempting to claim the Hungarian throne, leaving a young son, Ladislas, to continue the fight. Conflict then became a struggle between the Angevin claimants, Louis II and later Louis III, and the Durazzo claimants, Ladislas and later Joanna II. The War of the Neapolitan Succession fractured the kingdom, leading to periods of anarchy, a weakening of royal authority, and endless power struggles among the Neapolitan barons, who shifted their allegiances based on opportunism. Cities and regions were repeatedly captured and recaptured, changing hands with bewildering frequency. The conflict drained the kingdom's resources, disrupted trade, and caused immense suffering for its people. Joanna I's life had been a series of dramatic turns, but her death, a violent act driven by dynastic ambition, proved to be the ultimate trigger for a protracted and bloody war that would reshape the political landscape of southern Italy for generations. Her legacy and the legacy of her final desperate choice of heir was written in the blood and ashes of the Neapolitan War of Succession. Number 2. Margaret, Maid of Norway. In September 1290, a small ship sailed across the turbulent waters of the North Sea, carrying a precious cargo, a 7-year-old girl named Margaret. She was the granddaughter of King Alexander III of Scotland and the daughter of Eric II, King of Norway. More importantly, she was the last surviving direct heir to the Scottish throne. Alexander III had died unexpectedly in 1286 after falling from his horse, leaving no male heirs. His only surviving child, Margaret's mother, had already passed away, making little Margaret the only one left in the direct line of succession. She was recognized as the Queen of Scotland by the Scottish Parliament, an unprecedented move for a child and for a queen in her own right. The plan was for Margaret to sail from Norway to Scotland, where she would be formally crowned. Her arrival was eagerly anticipated, as her reign was seen as the best hope for securing the independence and stability of the Scottish kingdom. To further solidify the peace and potentially unite the two powerful kingdoms, a marriage had been arranged between Margaret and Edward of Caernarfon, the young son of King Edward I of England. Treaty of Birgham, signed in 1290, meticulously laid out the terms of this union, emphasizing that Scotland would retain its distinct laws, liberties, and independence, but fate in its cruelest form intervened. The journey across the North Sea was rough, and the child queen, already frail, became severely seasick. As the ship approached the Orkney Islands, a storm began to brew, and her condition worsened rapidly. Margaret, the tiny figure upon whom the future of a nation rested, succumbed to her illness. She died on September 26, 1290, before ever setting foot on Scottish soil. Her death was not just a tragedy. It was an unmitigated disaster for Scotland. With Margaret gone, the direct line of succession was completely severed. The Scottish throne was suddenly absolutely vacant with no clear, undisputed heir. This left a void that immediately sparked the Great Cause, a period of intense and often violent succession disputes. 13 different claimants, many of them distant Scottish kings, immediately stepped forward to assert their right to the throne. The two most prominent claimants were Robert de Bruce, often known as Robert the Elder, grandfather of the future King Robert de Bruce, and John Balliol, both powerful Scottish nobles with legitimate though indirect claims to the throne. Their rivalry was fierce and deeply divisive among the Scottish nobility. The Scottish guardians, who had been governing the kingdom during Margaret's expected arrival, found themselves in an impossible position. Unable to resolve the succession dispute peacefully among themselves, they made a fateful decision. They appealed to King Edward I of England to arbitrate the dispute. Edward I, known as Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots, was a formidable and ambitious monarch who had long harbored desires to exert greater control over Scotland. Edward seized this opportunity with alacrity. He demanded that all claimants acknowledge him as the feudal overlord of Scotland before he would even begin the arbitration process. This was a profound humiliation for Scotland, effectively undermining its independence. Desperate for a resolution, the claimants, including Bruce and Balliol, grudgingly agreed. For 2 years, Edward I meticulously presided over the Great Cause, examining genealogical claims and legal arguments. In 1292, he eventually ruled in favor of John Balliol, who became King John of Scotland. Edward's choice seemed to provide a temporary resolution, but it was far from peaceful. Edward I immediately began to assert his overlordship in an unprecedented and oppressive manner. He treated Scotland as a vassal state, demanding feudal homage, intervening in Scottish legal affairs, and even forcing Scottish nobles to serve in his foreign wars. John Balliol, a weak king, quickly chafed under this heavy-handed domination. Culmination of Margaret's death and Edward's subsequent actions led directly to the Wars of Scottish Independence. In 1295, John Balliol, fed up with Edward's bullying, renounced his homage to the English king and formed an alliance with France as the Old Alliance. This was an act of open defiance. Edward I, enraged by this perceived betrayal, invaded Scotland in 1296. He swiftly defeated the Scottish army, deposed John Balliol, stripped Scotland of its regalia, and declared himself the ruler of Scotland. This act of conquest ignited a full-scale war for independence that would last for decades, led by figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Margaret, Maid of Norway, a child who never ruled, became a silent catalyst for one of the most defining and bloody conflicts in British history. Her death, an unforeseen twist of fate, created a vacuum that allowed the ambitions of a powerful neighbor to ignite a centuries-long struggle for Scottish sovereignty. Number 1. Sibylla, Queen of Jerusalem. In the blistering heat of Acre in July 1190, Queen Sibylla of Jerusalem lay dying. She was barely into her 30s, but the city besieged and ravaged by disease during the Third Crusade was a death trap. Sibylla was no ordinary queen. She was a reigning monarch, having inherited the fragnate and then embattled Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem after the death of her brother, Baldwin IV, the leper king, in 1185. Her reign, along with her second husband, Guy of Lusignan, had been marked by constant internal strife among the Crusader nobility and devastating external pressures from the formidable Muslim leader, Saladin. Just 3 years earlier, in 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin, where Saladin's forces annihilated the Crusader army, capturing Jerusalem itself and most of the Crusader. Sibylla and Guy had managed to escape to Tyre, a small coastal city that remained in Crusader hands. When the Third Crusade, led by the likes of Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip Augustus of France, arrived to reclaim the Holy Land, Sibylla and Guy joined the siege of Acre, hoping to regain a foothold. Conditions in the Crusader camp outside Acre were horrific. Disease, starvation, and constant skirmishes with Saladin's forces took a heavy toll. Sibylla, already weakened by the stresses of her reign and the trauma of the kingdom's fall, contracted one of the prevalent plagues. She watched helplessly as her 2 young daughters, Alice and Maria, died before her. Then in late July, she too succumbed to the illness. Sibylla's death was a moment of profound crisis for the Crusader state. She was the last surviving member of the royal line of Jerusalem, the direct descendant of Godfrey of Bouillon, who had first established the kingdom after the First Crusade. Her death meant that the legitimate hereditary claim to the throne of Jerusalem was now extinct. This created an immediate and violent succession dispute. Her husband, Guy of Lusignan, insisted that he remained king of Jerusalem by virtue of his marriage to Sibylla, clung fiercely to the title, believing it gave him authority over the Crusader armies and a claim to any territory that might be reconquered. However, many of the powerful Crusader barons and the newly arrived European Crusaders disagreed. They argued that Guy's claim was entirely dependent on Sibylla, and with her death his right to rule had vanished. They rallied around Isabella, Sibylla's half-sister, who was seen by many as the next legitimate claimant. Isabella was quickly forced to divorce her first husband, Humphrey IV of Touraine, and marry Conrad of Montferrat, a Minoc and militarily effective nobleman who had successfully defended Tyre from Saladin and was highly revered by the French contingent of the Crusade. The rivalry between Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat for the crown of Jerusalem exploded into open conflict. It was not a grand unified war, but a bitter divisive struggle within the Crusader camp itself, even as they were supposedly united against Saladin. The various factions of the Third Crusade, already prone to infighting between the French and English, were forced to take sides. The English King Richard the Lionheart, who had a good relationship with Guy of Lusignan, supported Guy's claim. The French King Philip Augustus and the powerful native Crusader nobility, however, largely favored Conrad of Montferrat, seeing him as a stronger and more capable leader for the beleaguered kingdom. This internal conflict undermined the Crusader efforts to reclaim Jerusalem. Resources were diverted to lobbying and political maneuvering, rather than solely to military campaigns against Saladin. Commanders refused to cooperate with each other. Jealousies festered, and vital military operations were hampered by the lack of a unified command. There were skirmishes between the factions, and the overall morale of the Crusader forces suffered. For months the dispute raged. Both Guy and Conrad acted as rival kings, issuing conflicting orders and vying for the allegiance of the knights. and soldiers. The siege of Acre, despite the Crusader victory, was a testament to the disunity caused by the succession crisis. Even after Acre fell, the infighting continued, with the various Crusader lords unable to agree on a clear political strategy for the reconquered territories. Eventually, in April 1192, after much deliberation and pressure from the major Crusader leaders, a council of barons and princes formally at Jerusalem. This decision was meant to settle the dispute, but just days later, Conrad was assassinated, plunging the succession back into chaos and suspicions. Isabella then quickly married Henry II, Count of Champagne, who became the new king consort, and Guy was compensated with the lordship of Cyprus. Sibylla's death had not just caused a crisis. It had ignited a devastating internal war of succession that fractured the Crusader kingdom at its most vulnerable moment. It diverted critical energy and resources, contributing to the ultimate failure of the Third Crusade to retake Jerusalem. Her absence from the throne and the vacuum it created directly led to the bloody infighting that weakened the Crusader states from within, ensuring their precarious future in the Holy Land.